Welcome back, Natural Resources. This is where we left off the other day, looking at the classification of soil. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to look at several different factors that are important into going into what makes a good soil, what makes a soil that is good for farming, good for building, and some that are just good for wetlands and animal habitats. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is soil texture. Again, this is an FFA competition, and so if you are interested in this is something that you think you would be good at, then we might look at doing this competition whenever we are no longer in a pandemic type situation. So, in taking a look at soil texture, we are first looking at those soil particles that we looked at last time. The amount of sand, silt, and clay that there is in a soil. They're going to be named according to their texture. We have this thing called a textural or a soil triangle, and more or less it tells you where the actual soil would lie on the soil triangle. Because if you think about it, unless you are strictly at the beach on the sand, most of the time you are going to have a mixture of soil, particles. So whenever we're looking at the texture, we're looking at soils that are sandy, which are going to contain mostly sand, soils that are clayey, which are going to contain mostly clay, and then you would think that the other one would be silt, but the silt is actually the particle size itself, and the third texture is actually what we call loamy, which is kind of an in-between. And so a lot of times people kind of get silt and loam confused. And loam is basically just a mixture of different sizes of soil particles. We figure that out by doing what's called soil ribbons. And this picture right here, basically what this person has done is they have taken a small handful of soil and they have taken it between their thumb and their forefinger and actually tried to push it out to make a ribbon. And if you could actually see me, I'm doing that with my finger, even though you can't see me. It's the soil ribbon. The more clay is in the soil, the longer the ribbon you're actually going to get from it. And you'll see that in the videos that I've posted on the page with this. And they actually do some soil ribboning. So all this has to do with the amount of clay typically that's in a soil. The longer the ribbon, normally the more clay that you're going to have in it. Sand is typically going to be sand and loamy sand. You can press it between your fingers, but you really can't form a ribbon on it. I mean, you can get a handful of sand, but whenever you try to get it to form out into a ribbon and get that soil to stick together, it's not going to, just because there is not enough clay in it in order to be able to do that. It tends to feel gritty because it has those large soil particles in it, those sandy particles, and it's really not going to stick to your hands. It's going to have really fast drainage just because you're looking at a sandy type soil, and you've got all those particles that are so large that have so much space in between them. A more cohesive soil and the preference of soil would be a loamy soil, and there's a really wide variation as far as loamy soils. You can have some sand in it, you can have some clay in it, it can be mostly silt. A sandy loam typically is not going to be able to be leafed out into a ribbon, but if you can, it's going to be very, very small. And so you might have just enough clay in it to get it to leaf out just a little bit or to ribbon just a little bit, but it's probably not going to be very much. The more clay and silt you get into it, the more smooth it's going to feel, and the more it's actually going to be able to be pressed out into a ribbon. Normally, a silty loam is going to have a ribbon that's going to break off anywhere between a half inch and an inch and a half, and really that's pretty generous. Saying that it would be as long as an inch and a half. Your loamy textures are going to have structure as well. And so when we're looking at structure, we're looking at how the actual soil clings together. Not the particle size, not necessarily how much clay is in it, but how does it cling together? And we're going to be looking at those structures in just a little bit. Friable and firm consistency, what they mean by that is how easy it is for that soil to be broken apart. We all, okay, maybe I was the only crazy kid, but my kids and I have this thing about when we were young, we would pick these dirt clods up and we'd throw them at our siblings. So I'm sure you never would do anything like that, but depending on how well the clod stays together, is that consistency that we're talking about, whether it's friable or firm. These are going to be the ones that are going to be the most desirable as far as root growth, because you're going to have lots of room for air and water, pore space in there. Clayey soil is what we're looking at in this part of the state. When these are wet, you're going to have those ribbons. You're going to be able to leaf out that soil in between your fingers, and you may get something anywhere from 1 to 2 inches long. They're sticky almost, so you're going to have they have very cohesive because they're going to be able to stick together, and you can actually mold them into forms. You can actually create pottery and things out of them if you have a tremendous amount of clay in them. You can see your thumb impression in these typically because you've got enough clay in there that you actually can imprint that thumbprint in there. These may be blocky, platy, or massive in structure, and we're going to talk more about that. And typically they're going to be firm or very firm in consistency. Basically, when we're looking at this, we're looking at soils that will stick together, and they will create massive dirt clods, and they will stay together during the process of throwing those dirt clods at people or trying to crush them. Soil structure, we're going to look at, and we've talked a little bit about soil structure. I've mentioned it in passing with the different types of textures. The soil structure is just how it's all put together. When you go to the beach and you look at the sand, you pick up the sand and you put it in your hands, it's normally going to run through your fingers, especially if it's dry. That's a single grain structure. And we're going to talk about all these different structures right here. So each individual particle in single grain structure is going to stand alone. You can pick out each individual particle. So really, this is going to be reserved for a sandy type of soil because you cannot pick out a silt or a clay molecule, whereas you can pick out one single grain of sand. What's most ideal is when the soil actually sticks together like this. This is a granular type of soil structure. You're not going to be able to pick out a single grain in this soil, but it is going to be soft. It's going to be easy to plant stuff in. It's going to be easy to work with, and this is going to be what's ideal if you're looking at a gardening or planting type of situation. Typically found with loamy sand, sandy loam type soils. You may get a little clay in there, but typically it's going to be mostly your sandy loams. When you start getting more clay in, then it starts to form blocky structure, which is this, everything's kind of sticking together. We see a lot of this in this area because we do have so much of that red clay in our soil. So the particles are going to cling together to form these, what we call them peeds, and these little just blocks of soil would be what we're talking about when we're looking at a blocky structure. Not terrible for planting, just not ideal. You want to, if you have an opportunity to actually include some amendments to the soil, it would actually help it as far as the drainage. Platy, with this you can actually see that it looks like there's sheets or plates, and they're kind of piled on top of one another. Looks like somebody just kind of stuck a knife in there in between a couple of the plates. This typically has happened whenever there has been some sort of flooding, and so they kind of lay on top of one another and form sheets. The last one is massive, and when we're talking about massive, it's really, there is no structure. And a lot of times the massive soil is caused by somebody not managing it properly, and you're going to get huge clods of soil, and they're going to be difficult to break apart, difficult to plant things in. And so you have to actually really work this soil in order to get it to where it is in a usable form. So The structure itself is actually going to influence the soil properties. Water is going to move faster through a granular soil than it is through a blocky soil. It's going to move even faster through a single grain soil. If you think about waves crashing in on the beach, you literally can watch the water as it soaks in. It's important whenever we're looking at the structure of the soil, because this is going to help us figure out how well water is going to move through. How well are roots going to grow through in these particular types of soils? So whenever we're looking at how they're put together, that's when we're looking at the structure. I mentioned consistency, and consistency basically means how easy is it going to be to work with? How much resistance is there whenever you put a little bit of pressure onto the soil? How easy is it going to break apart? The consistency is going to be figured out by doing those ribbons. And there's different types of consistencies. And actually, you're going to take that soil peed and you're going to put it in between your thumb and your forefinger, and you're going to see if you can mash down on it. If you can mash down on it and break it apart, then you're going to have a fairly loose consistency. Sometimes you get really, really clayey soils that were almost like rocks, and they're going to have a firm consistency to them. So if we're looking at a loose consistency, we're looking at a soil that you can work with fairly easily. This is one that is loosely put together. Usually has a lot of sand in it, usually has this single grain texture to it. It's easy to work with and build things like sandcastles with, because, well, you can kind of move them around the way that you want them. The more friable and firm that you get, the more difficult it is to work with. Friable is going to be ideal. It's if we were looking at something like planting crops, friable is going to be ideal. Because it holds just enough consistency that it's going to stick together some, but it's not going to be so firm that you can't really work with it. And it's not going to be so loose that you could kick over the sandcastle and it's dead. So you're going to have a little bit of crumble with a little bit of pressure on this. Usually loamy soils, sometimes you have a little bit of clay in there, but the more clay you get in there, the more difficult it is to actually work with, and you start getting into a firm consistency. And you really, if you think about the soils that we have here as compared to what is out on the coast, the sandy soil is so soft to work with, but it's not necessarily going to be the best as far as planting things in. But the soil out here is for sure going to hold more water, but it is going to be more difficult to work with because it's going to be harder and packed together. So we're talking about that consistency. That's what we're talking about. How packed together is it, and how easily is it going to be to work with it? There's also some other consistencies whenever you get into the subsurface layer. So when we're not looking necessarily at the top of the soil, but when we get a little bit further down into the soil, we look at things like very firm, like is it almost like a rock where we can't really do anything at all with it? Is it sticky? Is it non-sticky? Is it very sticky? And if you were actually in one of these soil judging competitions, you would literally have a bucket of water that you were using to figure out the consistency of the subsoil, because this has to be done whenever it's wet. A very strong consistency or firm consistency is going to resist crushing. Most of the clays that we see are going to be either firm or very firm, because they just don't break apart very easily. We know that from trying to work the soil in this particular area. The non-sticky, again, we're looking at this when it's wet. So you take that bucket of water, you put a little bit of water on it. If it sticks to your hand and your fingers, then you're looking at a sticky consistency. If it doesn't, then you're looking at a non-sticky consistency. Typically, the more clay it has in it, the stickier it actually is. The soil is going to cling to one finger with a sticky consistency, and Loamy and clay soils may be sticky. Typically, it's the amount of clay that they have in them that's actually going to make them sticky. And then you've got the very sticky, and this is where it actually sticks to both fingers. So if you are trying to pull it apart and it's sticking to both fingers and you're having some problems trying to pull your fingers apart, then that's a very sticky consistency. And, it can cause problems whenever you're trying to plant things, build things. That very sticky consistency just does not do well for being able to manipulate the soil. So these are going to be ones that are really, really high in clay content. All right, so move on. We'll look at erosion. And we are going to look more at erosion in the next section. But it is one thing that we do have a tendency to judge when we're doing land judging is we want to look at erosion and see, is there any erosion in the area where we're judging the soil? Erosion by wind and water. And the reason we look at that is because it affects the productivity of the soil. It affects what you can actually do with it. It affects how much topsoil there actually is. And so you're going to look at the top 6 inches of the surface layer and see how much erosion you notice there. And in your erosion classes, you're going to look at things like those top 6 inches. If it all looks pretty similar in characteristic, then there's probably not a whole lot of erosion. But if you have got mixed soil from the subsurface in the top 6 inches, then you're probably looking at a moderate erosion. If you don't have any topsoil at all and you're really just going down into subsoil, then you probably have got some pretty severe issues with erosion. So we'll talk more about erosion in the next section when we talk about water, because that erosion and water tend to go together. Permeability is next. And really, we're looking at how easily and how quickly water is going to travel through the soil. We also call this drainage. And it really depends on the structure, it depends on the texture. Sandy soil water is going to move through that so quickly because those particles are so big and you have so much space in between particles. But clay particles are so small and they fit so closely together that water is just not going to move through it very quickly. And so that's why we see a lot of issues in clayey areas with runoff and flash flooding, because it just can't run through the soil very quickly. So we're looking at permeability. We're also looking at infiltration, and that's the movement of the surface water into the soil, and the percolation, which is actually the movement further down in through the soil. So how quickly does it go down into the soil, and how quickly does it flow through the soil? There's different categories of permeability, and it's based on what type of texture that you're looking at for the most part. Rapid is going to be associated with sandy texture. It moves through fairly quickly. And then you get all the way down into your moderates and slows. Very slow, you're looking at clay subsurfaces, blocky structure, massive structure, sometimes even platy. You're looking at things that it's really, really hard to get the water through that soil without it just running off. So permeability, we are specifically looking at how quickly does it seep into the soil and how quickly does it go through the soil. So those are the two things we're specifically looking at as far as permeability. Soil depth. Now, this is kind of deceptive a little bit, because you think, well, you could dig all the way to China, you could dig all the way to the mantle of the earth. But really, what we're looking at here as far as soil depth is how deep is it that you actually can work with. We have all been in situations where we're trying to dig a hole and we hit a rock. Is there some reason why we can't actually dig further into the soil? So soil depth, a deeper A horizon typically means, and that's your topsoil, that you've got greater fertility, because it's just got way more of that nutrient value in it. Depth is typically considered as very shallow, whereas if you are looking at how deep you actually can work with the soil, you're looking at, I think I've got, oh, okay, never mind. So we're looking at depth. We're looking at just how deep you can dig into the soil and actually work with it. The depth to limiting layer means that you're going to have some restrictive root movement and water movement, and if you get to that point, then it's not going to be very good for working with. I'm not really sure why we have the depth on two slides back to back. That's what I was looking at. But whenever we're looking at the depth to limiting layer, we're looking at how deep is it until you get to some sort of a limiting factor, whether it be rocks or roots or whatever. And so we're looking at how deep can you actually dig into the soil and actually work with it. We need to look at slope. Slope is important in erosion factors. There's certain things you don't want to plant on certain types of slopes. You probably don't want to do a whole lot of crop farming on a very slopy hill or a very steep slope. So when we're looking at slope, it's important because we want to see what we can actually do with the soil. It's going to be expressed in a percentage. You can see what has happened with this particular picture here. Of course, this is, obviously animated, but or more like a cartoony picture. But you can see how it causes things like curved tree trunks. It can cause problems with foundations if you try to plant something or build something on a very slopy soil. You can cause problems with tilted phone lines, tilted gravestones. This is also going to cause a lot of erosion issues. You can see how the soil is actually washing into this roadway down here. It looks like they've got some sort of a silt fence or something up. So when we're looking at slope, we're looking at how much of a hill there actually is. And if this is just an example, that a 4% slope means that you have got a land surface that's going either up or down by 4 feet for every 100 feet of difference. So that's not a very steep slope. It's really not much of a slope at all. So these are the 6 slope classes. If you are building, you want to be somewhere along in here. The closer you get to these strongly sloping and steeply sloping, you're looking at things like tree farming and stuff like that. So you're really not looking at a tremendous amount that you can do with very steeply sloping hills. Drainage is super important. Where I come from in the eastern part of the state, we have a lot more drainage problems there than there are here. And really, it has more to do with the fact that we are so close to sea level down there. Where I'm from, it's very swampy. And so it's very flat and low-lying area. And so drainage makes a big difference in what you can actually do. You don't see a lot of swampy areas in this particular part of the state. So whenever you're looking at drainage, you want to look at, you're looking for these things called drainage models. And we'll see that on the next slide. But it's just basically little gray pieces of soil or little gray parts of soil where it has actually damaged the soil structure. It's damaged what's going on in the soil, and it makes it pretty rough looking. It doesn't help it as far as fertility and nutrient value. So your drainage is going to be important in soils because of the development of the soil itself and what you can actually do with it. And so a lot of times you'll hear people talking about groundwater and water table, and not so much in this part of the world, but especially in the eastern part and in some of the coastal areas around the United States. You look at water table, and if you get too high above the water table, you're looking at flooding issues. And so that's why whenever there's hurricanes, the eastern part of the state is so worried about flooding. It's not that it can't go through the soil, there's just nowhere for it to go. This is what I was talking about, though. These are drainage models, and these drainage models right here just show that there are some pretty serious issues with water not draining the way that it's supposed to. So typically drainage, when you start seeing drainage models, you are looking at low-lying areas that hold water. Could be an issue in this part of the state if you're looking at a place where it's a valley and there's no runoff. But for the most part, you're looking at areas closer toward the eastern part of the state where you are in a lower lying area, and the water table is just going to be so much closer to the surface. As far as drainage classes, you got well all the way down to very poorly. If you get to a point where you have a very poorly drained soil, you're looking at literally black soil in the top 6 inches. Um, where I'm from, we've had a lot of hurricane issues, flooding issues, and I'm thinking about one field in particular. And anytime there's any kind of flooding, there's water standing in that field. And pretty much any time of year, you can ride by there, and the soil is black. I mean, there's really not a whole lot that they can do with it. You really can't build there because the it's just not going to hold up. You're going to have issues with foundation and flooding. And there's really not a lot of great farmland that you can do anything with whenever it's poorly drained like that. So, um, kind of depends on where you are, what part of the state you're in, how much slope there actually is, what type of structure you're looking at, whether there's actually good drainage or not. Okay, last thing is land capability classes, and there are 8 different classes, and those classes tell you what you can do with the soil. What is it good for? And these are Roman numerals 1 to 8. And all this is based on all that stuff that we've looked at. So when we're looking at soil judging competition, we start with we look at the slope, we look at the erosion, we look at the A horizon, and what does the A horizon look like, its texture, its structure. And then we look at the B horizon, and what does it look like, its texture, its structure, its permeability. All of these things go into figuring out what a land is good for. So the Roman numerals are anywhere from 1 to 8. Ideal is 1. Probably not a whole lot of there's nothing perfect, but probably not a whole lot of limitations with a number 1. Number 2 is also good as well, and when you get down into number 3, still not bad. When you start getting to number 4, you're looking at things that are going to be good for pastures, maybe putting livestock on. Probably not necessarily the best cropland, but still can be used for agricultural purposes. When you get into Class 5, you're really not going to want to put crops on it. Usually you've got drainage issues, rocks, or something like that. When you start getting down into the 6, 7, and 8 category, you're looking at very limited uses for these types of soils. Pasture, woodland, wildlife habitats, Christmas tree growth, steep mountains, beach. Usually it's not very good as far as productive use, but it can be used for wildlife purposes and recreation purposes. So when you start getting into those classes 6, 7, and 8, especially 7 and 8, you're really looking at soil that's not very well fit for doing a whole lot with. So those capability classes are based on all this stuff that we put together in order to figure out what the soil is actually good for. So that is probably the fastest that I have ever gone through anything soil related, because I know that you have got other things to do, and this is becoming a long video. So if there are things that you have questions about, please make sure that you ask those questions. This is something that I really used to enjoy doing whenever I was in high school. I liked land judging. I hadn't done it in quite a while, so it is a lot to absorb in just one PowerPoint. So if you have questions, make sure that you ask those questions, email me, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do a little bit of this in class. So next time we will take a look at erosion and water, and that will be in the next week's lesson. So take care, and I will see you soon.